Hello, everyone. Today we are again very challenging a topic between the US and the Turkey relations. We will speak with Craig Fildius on the CAATSA and the recent F-16 deal between the US and the Turkey. Craig, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everybody. As Safak mentioned, my name is Craig Fildius. I am a now retired special agent with BIS. Retired in November of last year, and my last posting before I retired was a 5-year stint in Istanbul, Turkey, at the U.S. consulate there. So I'm very happy to be with everybody today. Definitely an interesting topic. Had a lot of experience with it while I was in Turkey. So happy to put out some information for everybody and also answer as many questions as possible.
Yeah, all the questions are welcome, by the way. I want to start the background of the story. Actually, on December 14, 2020, the US Department of State imposed Section 231 sanctions on the Republic of Turkey's Presidency of Defense Industries, SSB, for engaging in a significant transaction with Rosoboronexport, Russia's main arms export entity, by procuring a missile system. And the CAATSA Section 231 allows for the imposition of a certain money-based sanctions on persons who knowingly engage in a significant transaction with a person that's a part of or operates for or on behalf of the defense or intelligence sectors of the government of the Russian Federation. And now the SSB is subject to the following restrictions, which includes a prohibition on granting specific US export licenses and authorizations for any goods or technology transferred to the SSB, a prohibition on loans or credits by the US financial institutions to SSB totaling more than $10 million in any 12-month period, a ban on US export-import bank assistance for exports to SSB, a requirement for the United States to oppose loans benefiting SSB by international financial institutions, and blocking sanctions imposed on some certain SSB executives. And just recently, the Congress has approved the F-16 deal, and this complicates the issues and the legal framework of the CAATSA sanctions, as the SSB is the agency of the defense procurement in Turkey. So, Craig, I want to ask you about the implications of the CAATSA sanctions. What do you think about the CAATSA?
In regard to the F-16 deal?
Yeah.
So, yeah, again, thank you, Safak, and you covered a lot of, you covered the overview of CAATSA. I was going to discuss it a little bit, but Safak did such a great job. So I think he highlighted the main points. I guess the only other two things that I wanted to point out regarding the CAATSA sanctions when they were implemented, for those who are familiar with the DDTC entity in the United States, they're the ones that deal with the munitions list and granting licenses for that. When CAATSA was implemented, they were very clear about not granting new licenses, new license applications, but applications that had been previously approved were okay to go through. Whereas BIS, when CAATSA came out, they were very clear about not approving new licenses, that there would be a policy of denial in place for new license applications. However, they were not as clear about applications that had already been approved, and that caused a bit of confusion in the business community, or kind of confusion, but also like, well, if we already had an application approved, what are we supposed to do? And they also had discussed the subsidiaries. Both agencies talked about subsidiaries of SSB, which is what I dealt with a lot. And so DDTC was more clear about reviewing those licenses on a case-by-case basis, whereas, again, BIS, it was a bit murky or not as clear what I eventually learned by going through the process was that they were looking at those on a case-by-case basis as well. So just a few added points. I will tell you that I remember when the CAATSA sanctions were put into place. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I remember it because I remember I was at the gym on the treadmill at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I get a phone call from the embassy from one of my colleagues saying the US ambassador needs talking points and he needs them now. What does all this mean? So I had to cut my workout short and go back to my apartment and start putting together some talking points for CAATSA, because everybody knew that this was going to impact, the business industry in Turkey quite significantly. Because as we all know, and I spent 5 years in Turkey, I do consider it my second home. Anything defense related, SSB is involved. But they're kind of involved. It's kind of they're behind the scenes, right? So they're the ones putting out the tenders. The interesting thing about SSB, right, is they don't take possession of anything. They don't take possession of physical products, right? In the export world, as an export control officer, that's normally what we deal with. We're looking at companies that are physically taking possession of US products and then asking them what they're doing with it. SSB, right? They, again, put out the tenders and they are putting out the laundry list of things that they need, but they're never physically taking control of those things. They're typically going to a defense contractor in Ankara, for example, like an Accession, or somebody else like that, who are really working on their behalf. And so on some of the export licenses that I was seeing for defense contractors in Turkey, SSB wasn't listed anywhere. But if you were in Turkey and knew the system like I did and others, you knew that SSB was involved, because Aselsan and others weren't ordering things without getting a contract, especially if they're supplying the military. They're not doing anything without getting that contract from SSB. So they're kind of behind the scenes. And it wasn't that anybody was deliberately leaving them out of the license, but I think a lot of folks didn't really think that they needed to put SSB on the license because there was no physical handling of products, right? So it was really just like the companies involved in the transaction. To get to Safak's specific question about this deal that was just approved in late January for 40 F-16s to Turkey, and how is that going to impact CAATSA? Look, from a long-term perspective, I'm not in politics. I think everybody that's on the call understands there's politics at play. What I was telling Safak before this call started was, I think it's certainly a step in the right direction, right? This was the whole reason the sanctions were put in place was because Turkey purchased the S-400 system from Russia. That was the problem. That was the trigger. I think now, with Turkey agreeing to approve Sweden's admission to NATO, the approval of this F-16 deal, I think both of those things will weigh in good favor with Turkey. How does that impact CAATSA long term? We will see, because that is a decision that's going to be made at the presidential and congressional level. Congress, if for example, CAATSA was to be removed, or Turkey or SSB was to be unsanctioned, let's say, that would take an act of Congress, with approval from the president. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's at a level way above me. What I'm saying as someone that was an export control officer, having been in Turkey, I actually met with SSB once or twice before CAATSA. So I'm very familiar with them. I think these two things that just recently happened is a step in thawing a relationship that was previously a bit cold, and maybe these are some of the steps that need to be taken to convince the United States Congress and the president that, that CAATSA at some point in time down the road should be removed. So I think that's kind of the way that I'll answer that question.
Yeah, what do you think about the CAATSA? I know that you have some critics to CAATSA.
What do I think about CAATSA just in general?
Just in general.
Well, again, this is we could probably talk for an hour about sanctions in general, and do sanctions work, right? That's always the big question. Do they work? And I think it depends. I think you can look at certain historical situations where sanctions have been applied, where they did work. Other situations, critics would say, well, the sanctions don't work. It really just harms the individual people. I think CAATSA specifically, when I was in Turkey, I visited a lot of companies in the defense sector, specifically in Ankara. It didn't appear as if they were tragically impacted by it. Business was still moving forward. They were still making things that they needed to make for the military. So I'm not sure, again, because SSB as a government entity, when you sanction them, I think the intent, I know what the intention was. Is it working? If that's your question, Sabak, do I think it's working, or is that what you're essentially asking me?
Yeah.
I think, yes, I think to a certain degree it's working. I don't know if it's worked as well as other historical events in past times. Like I said, I think a lot of the defense contractors that I visited, like Accession and others, they kept doing business. Things were well. They still had a good customer base. But there were certain things that they had trouble getting for their manufacturing assembly line, if you will, and had to turn to, say, Europe, for example, to get some things that they might have normally gotten from the United States in the past. But because SSB was involved in the transaction, it was difficult for them to get certain products, or the process of getting the products was heavily delayed. Because what I will tell you is, and what I learned, because I was getting a lot of questions from companies about CAATSA, what BIS was ultimately doing, because I would have to have conversations with headquarters about whether or not, hey, this license, should it be approved? Should it not be approved? Is the end user a legitimate end user? What I found out was BIS was reviewing all of these license applications on a case-by-case basis. And so even though SSB was involved in the transaction in terms of like putting out the tender and ordering the parts, depending on what the product was, depending on who the end user was, again, I'm just using Accession as an example because they're quite popular and well-known in Turkey. Mm-hmm. If they were the end user of the product, everybody knew Accession in Washington, D.C. Everybody knew them to be a legitimate defense contractor. Turkey is part of NATO, so we needed their alliance. And so a lot of what Accession was making was for the military. So if we knew that was where the U.S. product was going, in some of those cases, the licenses were approved. So it really did come down to a case-by-case situation. And so it was very different than, for example, the sanctions that the U.S. has applied to Iran, where basically almost nothing can go to Iran. That wasn't the case in my experience, that wasn't the case with a lot of the end users attached to some of these SSB contracts now, or licenses. Now, some of them were denied, but some were approved. Mm-hmm. So I think BIS took that into account. And it was, I think there was a bit of a balancing act because Turkey is a NATO ally, right? They're part of the alliance. And so certainly the United States was upset when they purchased the S-400 after months of saying, please don't do that. but we also recognize that they are a NATO ally. They were pivotal to the region, and they still are pivotal to the region, and that some of these licenses needed to be approved.
Yeah. I think we have one question from the audience, but before moving to the questions, I would like to ask you about the offsets, actually, because the SSP is managing the offsets in Turkey, and if there will be any offset agreement under this deal, I don't know how will it be controlled and managed by means of the CAATSA, because there will be sanctions and the prohibition of the US export licenses to SSP, and SSP in no case will be involved for the export license issues. So what do you think about that?
On the offset part, you mean?
Yeah.
I'm trying to give it's slightly hard to tell. I mean, I think with the approval of this deal, so I'm right. So we've approved this deal for 40 F-16s and also for like parts and components and repairs and all that kind of stuff and technology upgrades to the airplane. But at the same time, we've got CAATSA still in play. So, yeah, if you could just break down, well, just be on the offset part a little bit more specific. When you talk about offsets, what exactly and how that relates to CAATSA, what exactly are you asking me? What do you mean?
SSP is the agency managing all the offset contracts and offset projects in Turkey, which may include some new export licenses. And right. I want to understand where the US companies should stand when there is a CAATSA in place in negotiation with the SSP.
Yeah, okay, I got you. So, yeah, it's tricky, right? It's tricky. I think as long as CAATSA is still in place, and you know, I'm sure you know this, Safak, but maybe the audience doesn't. When CAATSA was being discussed, the president had a list of 12 sanctions he could choose from. And he had to choose 5, right? And so you listed the 5 when you gave your opening remarks, 5 of the 12. So I think it's tricky. I think you have this deal that just took place, which is certainly a positive step in the right direction, but then you also still have CAATSA in place. So I think I'm just going to go back to what I said. I think US companies are still going to go through the export license process with BIS. And I think each license is going to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. And I do think this deal for planes is again thawing the relationship that has been cold for the last couple of years. And I think because of that thawing and the warming up maybe of the two sides with each other, I think that might allow for, even though CAATSA is still in place, it might allow for more export licenses to be approved, even with SSB involved in the transaction. So I don't know specifically what U.S. companies have been told, and from BIS or what they're specifically doing. If you're asking my opinion, I think again this deal is a step in the right direction, and I do think each license is going to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, because I don't think BIS wants to deprive one of our NATO allies necessarily of critical material or weapon systems that they need, and they're going to need some of those things from the United States. I hope that kind of answers it. It's more of an opinion than for sure.
So, Craig, what about the removable, the listing from the CAATSA? Is that something possible, like the Treasury Department, or how it works?
Sure. So look, anything is possible in terms of removal from any list, right? But let me emphasize to the audience, there's a difference between a company being added to, for example, the BIS entity list, or being, sanctioned by OFAC. There's a clear-cut process that companies can go through to be removed. and it can happen. There's with CAATSA, as I said before, it's going to be a presidential and congressional decision at some point in time as to whether or not SSB should be delisted, if you will, or unsanctioned by, State Department. I don't know specifically what the process is. I will tell you that. I do not know what the formal process is they have to go through. I think part of it is probably going to be at the diplomatic level, at the presidential level, discussions between two presidents, where they believe their relationship is. And then, I think if the United States gets a warm and fuzzy about where we are moving forward, that's where then Congress will get involved, because it's only Congress that can remove. That's the thing. They're the ones that implemented it. They're the only ones that can remove it. So it's very different than, getting removed from the entity list. Mm-hmm. Very different, and a bit more and much more complicated, and dealt with at a much higher level in government than somebody like me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have a question from the audience. What about the subsystem and or components that are being sold to Turkey from the USA? For those, still the suppliers in the USA are asking EUS forms in which those subject sanction clauses are being highlighted. And the customer in Turkey doesn't want to sign those forms, as all those systems that will be developed by the Turkish customers will be integrated and or delivered to a Turkish platform which is signed by a signed between SSB and the Turkish platform producer. How can we overcome this?
Sorry, let me just so the suppliers in the US are still asking for end user forms. Customers didn't want to sign those forms. Yeah, again, this is okay. I understand it. Yeah, I mean, again, this is tricky, and this is what I was dealing with as an export control when this went into place December 14th, 2020. I was dealing with this every day after that until I left the country. This is the tricky part, right? Because let's just look at it in a practical term. Turkish company, defense contractor, wants to buy something from a US company, and they're going to integrate it into a larger system that eventually is going to go into a Turkish defense system. And the Turkish company is asked to sign an end user statement. Well, again, this is what makes this is why I was having a lot of phone calls with headquarters, right? Because again, let's just say you're a Selsun buying something from the United States and you're integrating it into a system, let's say that's going to the Turkish Armed Forces. Well, the end user of the product itself is actually the Turkish Armed Forces. It's the military. That's the end user of the finished product. And that finished product is what has the US components in it. Where SSB comes into play is they're the ones that put out the tender or the laundry list of items that were needed, and then the financial transaction, they're involved in that as well. So I think what rightfully confused a lot of Turkish companies is, well, the end user is the Turkish Armed Forces. That's correct. That's not a lie. It is. It's the Turkish Army or the Turkish Navy. Where on the end user form do we put SSB? So what was happening in some cases is, Turkish companies, in an effort to be honest, when they were having a conversation with the US company, would mention SSB and say, SSB is involved in this transaction. And then the US company would kind of rear back and say, oh, time out, hold on. We need to ask BIS. And that's where they would submit their application, list SSB as usually they were the purchaser, which is, that's where they would be listed on the license. And then again, this is where BIS would do a case-by-case analysis and look at the license application and say, okay, it's the Turkish Army. It's not going to North Korea. Accession is involved, a very reputable, defense contractor. Let's approve this license. So I think, because I want to say that, if you're a Turkish company listening to this call and you're asked to fill out an end user statement, I want to encourage you to continue to do that. You should do that. Because if you don't, it's going to raise other red flags. Like, why are you not signing this end user statement? What are you trying to hide? It lends to other questions by the US company naturally. So I would encourage you to fill out the end user statement with the actual end user on the document. And if you know that SSB is involved in the transaction, the right thing to do would be to advise the US company of that and let them go to BIS, notify them. And yes, there's some level of risk that the license might get rejected, but it may not either. It may be approved. And I've seen them get approved. I'm just telling everybody that I have seen that happen. So again, it's a great question. A very straightforward answer, other than I would encourage you to continue to sign end user certificates if the US company asks for it. Because if you don't, that's going to raise other questions. The US company is going to view that as a red flag, which will then lead to other potential issues. Mm-hmm. So it's tricky.
Yes, indeed. You were on the field for many years in Turkey, and you know the companies and the ecosystem here in Turkey. For you, according to you, what alternative diplomatic or economic measures could be employed to address the underlying issues behind CAATSA sanctions and fostering better cooperation between the US and Turkey, and potentially opening the new doors for the new trade opportunities?
You mean other than CAATSA, what could be implemented?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't think I get paid enough to answer that question. Yeah, it's tough. Listen, I dealt a lot. I got this question a lot and dealt with this a lot with the Russia sanctions that were implemented after the invasion of Ukraine and how that impacted the business community. Sometimes I guess the way the United States and other countries view situations is, sanctions are really the only option they have when they've exhausted all other options. And I know in the lead up to the CAATSA sanctions being implemented, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth about the S-400. And I think the US's position was, look, you're a NATO ally. We don't want you to buy that system. And then when Turkey did, certainly there isn't going to be some physical altercation between the two countries. So the only thing left really was CAATSA. What other options did the US have to try and send a message? I mean, from the BIS perspective, you always have, the entity list, the denied parties list, adding companies to that list. And that was a lot of what we discussed with the Turkish government when the Russia sanctions were implemented. And there was some back and forth about that as well, and some complications with that. And so our message was, okay, we'll just put all these companies on the BIS entity list then. That's what we'll do. Like, you're not leaving us any other option. We're asking for you to help us with this. If you're not agreeing to do that, then we're going to just put everybody on the entity list. So Safak, I really don't know if there's I don't know if there'd be another option to really send a message, because like I said, there's not going to be a physical
Yeah.
confrontation between the two countries. That's not going to happen. So what else? What's your other alternative to, it's sanctions to try and force the hand through economic measures by impacting the country economically. I mean, again, if you look at the U.S. and the relationship with Iran, that's what we've tried to do. And we don't want to go to war necessarily. So you try to implement these economic sanctions that, you hope turns the tide. It worked in South Africa years ago with apartheid. The sanctions were very effective, and you can see what happened there. Apartheid was overturned. And so that was one example of effective sanctions. So yeah, Safik, I'm not sure if there was anything else. I just remember there being months of discussion of, please don't buy the S-400. Please don't buy the S-400. You're not going to leave us much option. I do think when the president looked at the option, the list of 12 sanctions, I think the White House did its best to pick the 5 that were the least, that would least impact potentially Turkey. If I think there could have been some others that were more severe, but they chose these particular 5. And also, too, remember with the CAATSA sanctions, too, it wasn't for every single product in the United States arsenal. It wasn't a full blocking sanction. There were exceptions to every rule. So, yeah. Again, not a great answer, but the best I can do.
For those who do not know the full blocking sanctions and the menu-based sanctions, can you elaborate a little what CAATSA is intended to do and what is it for? Because it's not a full blocking sanction. It's not.
Right. Yeah. So the difference, I was actually reading about it today. So, full blocking, like basically, and I mean, you can all look it up, but there's blocking and non-blocking. Basically, non-blocking sanctions are less severe than blocking. Blocking, essentially, if you think of it this way in simple terms, U.S. persons anywhere in the world, not only in the United States, but U.S. persons, U.S. entities, and subsidiaries of U.S. companies overseas are not allowed to do business with these specific entities that have been sanctioned. So in this case, SSB. Non-blocking sanctions are less severe in the sense that it doesn't apply to all items, all products. It's certain things. Certain items, certain controlled products are going to be sanctioned from going to that entity, but not necessarily everything. I'm just going to read it to you right here. It just says non-blocking sanctions are generally less severe. Less severe because they do not prohibit U.S. persons from all transactions with the sanctioned parties, and they do not require U.S. persons to freeze assets owned by sanctioned targets. So with blocking sanctions, full blocking sanctions, if you're a U.S. entity abroad and you have assets in your possession that are owned by a sanctioned entity, you need to immediately freeze those assets. So like that applies primarily to like financial institutions, whereas non-blocking not necessarily. So that's something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. If there is any question from the audience, please use the Q&A box and we will be happy to answer the questions.
Yeah.
I will ask from a very general political perspective. And what do you think how does Turkey navigate its strategic partnership with both NATO allies and Russia, considering the potential contradictions arising from CAATSA sanctions and the current war in Ukraine?
How does Turkey navigate that relationship?
Yeah.
Great question. This is something I dealt with all the time, and I'll be very frank on this caller. After the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions, both by state and BIS, were implemented. So that was late February of 2022, right? 2022. for the last 18 months that I was in Turkey, all I did was deal with Russia sanctions. That was it. Everything else took a back seat. And, part of what I was doing was traveling around to private companies and speaking to them about what this meant for them, what they could and couldn't do. And these were small companies, medium size, and then some major big companies like, for example, Petrol Officer. I visited them a couple of times because of the fueling of US controlled aircraft, right? And so after a couple of months of doing this, and companies trying to figure out, to your point, stuff like how they're going to navigate this relationship, in one meeting, I don't remember who it was, but I think it was a relatively large company in Turkey. I said, listen, we're at a point now where you have to choose sides. That's what this comes down to. At some point, you have to pick sides. You've got, Russia on one side, and I understand, and I would say this to companies. I understand the relationship with Russia. I understand the energy situation between, a lot of your energy comes from Russia. I understand that. But then on the other side, you've got the United States, you've got a business relationship with our country, with Europe, all these other countries. And the same message was relayed in the most diplomatic fashion to government entities, not by me, but people higher than me in meetings saying, and I think I remember one of these officials saying, you need to choose. When I took a trip to, I think it was Kazakhstan, I met with the airport authority there. We were having the same issue there about, please stop fueling US export controlled aircraft. And I'll never forget the director. He looked right at me in the meeting and he said, we would love to comply with you. We want to cooperate, but we cannot. Because if we do, Russia will cut us off and will ruin us. So as much as we would like to help, it's impossible for us to do so. And I remember saying to him, I appreciate your honesty. And I relayed the message back to Washington. And I think sometimes in Washington, they're thousands of miles away. They don't understand, how complicated some of these issues are and how connected some of these countries are, not only from an economic perspective, but from a historical perspective. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that would be kind of how I was, that was what was happening in Turkey when I was there. And it was kind of the same with CAATSA. And I think, again, I can't speak for the White House, but I think part of the viewpoint was, you're part of NATO, our side, we think, yet you're now going to purchase this weapon system from Russia. So, how does Turkey navigate that as again, this can become a very deep conversation. I'm open to hear the audience give their thoughts, but it's a tough one to navigate because I again, on one side, Turkey as a country is allies with NATO, and we've had a historical relationship, the United States and Turkey. But then on the other side, you've got Russia right on up the Bosphorus, and you make a right. I mean, it's right there, and there's some reliance there as well. It's a very tough. The answer is, I understand it's tough to navigate, but as I had said to that one company, at some point in time, you're going to have to make a decision as to which side you're on and choose.
There's one very strong question from the audience.
Yeah.
Do you strongly believe that there are two main starting countries inside NATO, US and Turkey, and all others are co-starting, in fact, as we are Turkey, a most important country in the southeast wing in the NATO? Why all these problems are around us and between US and Turkey?
Do you strongly believe that there are two main starting countries? I'm just reading it again, just so I answer it properly. Right. So I don't know if we're the two stars of the show. I would argue, I'm sure some other countries would argue that, they're very important as well in NATO, like the UK and Germany. Germany's got what, the second largest economy in Europe or the third largest economy in Europe. So what I do think, and what I've always thought, and having lived and worked there for 5 years, the country of Turkey is just geographically, you are in such a critical part of the world. You're right. I mean, you're the gateway to Asia, as we know. But if you look at your borders, who you're bordered by, I don't think I have to, you've got Iran, you've got Syria, and you've got Iraq, and then up to the, the northeast, I guess, would be like Georgia, the Caucasus. But I'm primarily focused on Iran, Syria, and Iraq. You're in a very tough neighborhood. And also, and therefore it makes Turkey I would say, a very critical country to have in NATO. You're the last stop on the train before we get to that tough part of the world. Okay. So I think it's very important. My personal opinion is to maintain a relationship with Turkey, maintain that NATO alliance with Turkey. I think it's critical. I really do. I think it's critical. Why are there so many, to answer this last part of the question, why are there so many, therefore, why are there so many problems between the two countries? I don't know. I don't want to get too political. Trying to think of the best way to say it. I don't know, Safik, maybe you could take a stab at it. You're Turkish. I mean,
I have no comment on that.
Yeah, I think. Look, listen. I'll just answer it, I guess, by saying this, and I'll use the United States as a parallel. We've had a lot of different presidential administrations, right? Currently, we have Joe Biden in office. Prior to that, we had Donald Trump. Before that, it was Obama. George W. Bush before that, and then we have an upcoming election in November. Every administration is different. Every president's personality and way of dealing, let's just say on international issues and foreign policy issues, everyone has a very different way of dealing with things. Again, not to get too political, Trump had a very specific way of dealing with our NATO allies in some international affairs. Obama had a very different approach. Joe Biden has a very different approach. So keep it there to not get too political. But I think I think some of the problems that arise or have arisen haven't needed to. But, all political leaders have their own agenda, and that dictates how they deal with certain delicate international issues. And I'll kind of leave it at that. And I hope, I really do, because I love the country, love it. I really do hope that the relationship continues to go in the right direction, and we get back to a place where we once were. I really do, because I think Turkey has so much to offer. And listen, last year, 2023, for those that don't know, Turkey was the most visited country in the world by tourists, number one. And I know why. So I hope it's starting to head in a positive direction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Craig. If there is no further question, I think we can end up the session.
Okay. Yeah. I'll just end, if you don't mind, Safak, by saying thank you, for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. It always, for me, it's just great to be back connected with Turkey again. And listen, if there's, any further questions, or if you're on this call as representing a company and you have questions or issues that you need to deal with, or want to deal with, or don't know how to deal with and need advice, when I now work for the Export Control and Sanctions Advisors Company based out of DC, but I'm based in London. I actually live in London, so representing the company over here. So please feel free to reach out to me, contact me. I'm happy to help. We are a company filled with a lot of experts, people with, I think we have about 300 years of total government experience in different areas. So we've got a lot of expertise, and we're happy to help anybody that's out there that might have a concern or just want advice on how to navigate a complicated issue. Because the world is, as you can all see right now, just in turmoil. And so as a business, trying to navigate through all this turmoil can be challenging, but that's what we're there to do, to help out.
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day or night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.